Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Paul McGee, which is one of UK's leading speakers on the subject of change, workplace, relationships, and motivation. His best-selling book, SUMO, Shut Up and Move On, became an instant bestseller, and his book on self-confidence reached #1 on the business book chart and remained there for a further 24 weeks. Building on his background in psychology, Paul's aim is to deliver a practical, relevant message that can make an immediate impact on people's professional and personal lives. His approach is considered both inspirational and humorous as he seeks to deliver memorable experiences that equips people with insights and ideas to increase their personal effectiveness and impact. He has also spoken to over 750 organizations in 35 countries to date, and his work has been endorsed by elite performance director of the British Olympic Association, Sir Clive Woodward, and his clients include blue chip organizations, public sector bodies, and leading premiership football clubs. With that, I'd like to welcome you, Paul, to the podcast.
Charles, it's absolutely great to be joining you again, and your listeners and your viewers as well. Really good. Greetings from, I was going to say sunny Manchester. It was a week ago, but it's flipping back to typical Manchester weather now, grey and wet, but we're alive and kicking. We're all good.
Well, that's great. And thank you so much for joining me today. And I love to make the topic of this episode one of those great books that you wrote on straight talking and communicating and how to speak so people really listen, because I think that's needed now more than ever in this day and age by leaders. And having a straight talking guy like yourself and telling us how to communicate with greater impact, to me, is a really relevant topic for us to discuss.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely delighted. It's interesting when I'm doing my masterclasses and when I've done them with IMS, I often say people may have been to like a karaoke bar and maybe sung a song or watched one of their friends or work colleagues do it. But I then ask this question: is it fair to say that knowing the words to a song does not make you a great singer? And likewise, being an expert in your topic doesn't automatically make you a great communicator. The world is full of experts who sadly don't always know how to communicate their message well.
I agree with you completely. Let's get into some of those sins that you have 7 sins in that book that really a lot of leaders, even well-versed leaders, make. And we aren't going to have time to unpack all 7, but I'd like to get through a few and go a little bit deeper in those just to give our listeners some insight into those. And the first sin is failing to make your message sticky or memorable, which everyone wants their message and communication to be more memorable, but they don't know really how to do that. And I love your analogy that you use that we need to cover our message with Velcro rather than coat it with Teflon.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember one of my team went to see a high profile former athlete give a talk. And I was really keen, he was high profile. The company had spent a lot of money hiring him, and Vicky, my colleague, got a chance to see him. I saw her a week later and I said, "Vicky, what was he like?" And her first answer was, "Oh, he was gorgeous." I went, "Yeah, okay, fine. But what was his key message?" And she went, "Oh, now you're asking me." And there was this sense in which, a company might be paying for, a lot of money for a speaker. And actually, well, what was the real takeaway? Apart from having the name, the credibility of, oh, we had this celebrity speaker or this full of footballer or athlete or Olympian or mountaineer, great. But did you take anything away? And I think for sometimes it's in one ear and out the other. I mean, I'm known as the sumo guy, and people go, "Sumo, you don't look like a sumo to me." No, but I'm not a celebrity, and I've tried to think, well, how do I get people's attention? And so, as you've said, SUMO can stand for shut up, move on. It's provocative, but people might not remember my name is Paul McGee, but boy, do they remember the sumo guy. And I think there's a lot of things in my book and in my seminars I've done for IMS where I'm just saying to people, let's create pictures in people's minds. Let's tell stories stick. Let's use images and less actual text on our slides. There's just a lot for people to not just think about what am I going to say, but how am I going to say it in a way that is remembered? And I don't want to make a political comment here, but I do want to use an example, an American example, which here's what I say to the people in the UK. I'll go, in the 2016 presidential election in the United States, what was Donald Trump's, motto or mantra? And then I say, what was Hillary Clinton's? Now, it's not a judgment on either of those two personalities, but 90% of my British audience will say Donald Trump said, let's make America great again. And hardly anyone ever remembers what Hillary Clinton's was. Now, the fact is, you might not agree with somebody, you might not even share their values or their vision, but some people have an ability to communicate a message that's sticky and memorable, and other people whose views you might agree with more, perhaps, but perhaps they haven't tapped into what am I doing to make what I say sticky and memorable.
I love that. And getting back to what you said about the sumo guy, that brings a picture to your mind that gets remembered. It immediately gets their attention. It conjures up this visual image of a sumo wrestler that even though you're not in that white thong, right? And bouncing around the
Well, you can only see it up. You can only see me up to the waist. If I was to stand up, you'd have to have adult only put as a banner across the YouTube clip.
I love that. I love that. And that's why it's so important to have that message that's sticky, that to bring that visual to mind. Because you're right, your name doesn't conjure up something that's sticky or memorable, but by developing that visual image as the sumo guy, now people remember you. Now they have this visual image in their mind that they stick to. Now, I've heard this saying from other people that, which you kind of challenge this notion, that people are not going to remember what you say. They're going to remember how you make them feel, which I agree with. But you say, why can't it be both, right?
100%. I mean, it was Maya Angelou who came up with that phrase, who said, people always remember what you said, they always remember what you did, but they will remember how you make them feel. And that is true. But as you say, but why can't we just go, well, you're not going to remember any of this, but I'll make you feel good. So I have these postcards with 7 questions to help you sumo. And they are a takeaway that people have when they've heard me speak. So it's almost like a reinforcement, a reminder. And again, not being able to see this clearly, but they're all cartoons with certain questions. They're very visual and memorable. People stick them up on their fridges, on their office wall. And it's all my attempt to just kind of like communicate in a way that kind of like people remember things. It's like one of my props, because I have this concept I talk about in my sumo principles of leadership of hippo time is okay. What are hippos do in mud? They wallow. And that kind of sense, it is okay to not always feel okay. So I actually say to people, look, you don't, and obviously this is a more visual and more relevant message now with masks, but I say you don't always have to pretend to put the happy face on. Sometimes you have to. You've got to show up and put your game face on. But find 1 or 2 people where you can be really honest about how you feel. Now, some people might go, well, that's a bit of a stupid idea, but you know what? People start to think about the mask, if you like, and obviously it's a relevant metaphor as well. So I'm constantly thinking, how do I, and to make it sticky, I think we remember the simple. So I don't want to make this abstract. I want to make it simple and accessible for people. That's crucial to communication.
And I think that's also, that being the sin number 1 that you list in your book is these could be viewed as sins, but really as communication best practices. I mean, everyone wants their message to be memorable and sticky.
Absolutely.
We also want for that to happen though, and we can do a lot to encourage that by creating those visuals, creating compelling stories, but it's to really to understand the audience needs. And that's one of the other sins that you mentioned in there. Not many educators, not many speakers really take that into account enough, I believe. So, they don't know where their audience is and what their needs are. So it's like, and I love your analogy once again, because analogies paint these pictures in your mind that are great. It's like throwing a fire extinguisher to a drowning man and hoping it's going to help, right? It's not, because even if that message is memorable and sticky, but you don't know who you're talking to, it's going to have very little impact.
It's very much about making your message relevant. And I think, again, what can happen with communicators, presenters, whether it's to one person or they're communicating to many, is they become obsessed with what am I going to say? I'm saying, well, that's important, but who am I saying it to? What are their needs? What are their issues? What are their challenges? I want to scratch where people itch. And when I've done IMS seminars in the past and we've had these day events with people, and I know you're now flexible on how you run these events and do it virtually as well. But when I get that opportunity, I want to say, okay, for today to have gone well for you, what do you want to get from this session? And I try and get as much feedback as I can from people so that they begin to think of, in a sense, well, begin with the end in mind. What do I want to achieve? Now, when they flag that up, I'm in a position to, although I know what my content's going to be, but I can tailor it a bit more. I can emphasize things a bit more. And I'm just constantly thinking, what are people's issues? When people brief me when I speak at a conference, of course I need to know about the timings, but I'm saying, what are your audience's challenges? What is going to really help them? And they'll go, well, there's some issues around their well-being and their resilience. And, some have been around a long time and are resistant to change. And I'm going, okay, this is great. This is helping me. And the visual I use, and apologies because this particular one's got a bit of a problem at the moment, but it's slightly deflated. But I talk about the beach ball. Now, the thing is, you're looking at this beach ball and you're seeing the three colors, red, yellow, and orange. That's the audience's needs perspective. But I'm not seeing red, yellow, and orange. I'm actually seeing three very different colors, blue, white, and green. Now, when you're communicating, it's really important to be sure not just about your perspective, but what is your perspective of your audience? What are their real issues and their challenges? And one of the things I'm learning about persuasion and influence is it is important, even if you disagree with someone's perspective, try and take some time to understand it and explore how people have arrived at the conclusions they have arrived at. Because the more you understand your audience's perspective, and maybe they might become a little bit more open to your perspective. But if you just go in telling people they're wrong and this is why, and just always, it's just, forget it. It's not going to work.
I agree with you. And I think that really adds to the impact, to the memorable, to the stickiness of any message when you understand your audience. The other piece, or the other part of that first part of your book, and I think it's in sin number 4, it's focusing on features rather than selling benefits. I see that a lot. So when we're talking about these communication secrets, just want to let our audience know that whether you're a speaker, whether you're a leader of a team, whether you're an individual contributor, this can help your communication regardless of who you're speaking to. And this is the one sin that I've seen probably happen more often than any of the other ones that you mentioned in your book, at least from my personal experience. When people try to sell something, they always sell based off the features. They don't sell based off of the benefits to the audience, the WIFM, what's in it for them. They don't have that mindset thinking, which is unfortunate, right?
Certainly. And again, you can get it within people who are perhaps coming at things from a slightly more academic perspective, or they're real experts. I mean, I'm actually now a professor. I got that title in 2019. I'm a visiting professor at the University of Chester. But I don't want to slip into this being highly academic and highly abstract. I keep on thinking about my audience, and I think I'm not just here to tell, I'm here to sell my message. And you sell it by, as you say, addressing that question, what's in it for me, or why should I care? There was an example I got from a book, and I do apologize. It might have been a Daniel Pink book. And he talked about, it was a park somewhere in the US a few years ago, where basically dog walkers weren't cleaning up after their dogs. And though there was a sign that said, please clean up after your dog, it just wasn't happening. And then someone came up with the bright idea of adding, I think it was 3 extra words to the sign.
Right.
And it was, so please clean up after your dog, children play here. And those 3 words suddenly gave the dog walkers a reason. Oh yeah, I need to do that. Yeah, because children, why should I care? Well, I should care because I don't want children. It could be my child or my granddaughter or my niece or my nephew who could, no, you don't want that. And sometimes we're very clear on going back to the beach ball on my perspective and why I see the benefits like it's obvious, but it might be obvious to me that this beach ball is blue, white, and green, but it's not to the audience. So I need to spell it out so people can see things more clearly. So most people don't see themselves as salespeople, but to some extent, we all have to be people who are able to be persuasive and sell our ideas to other people.
You're absolutely right. And I think that point bears repeating because I've noticed it in my own life as well that I need to understand better or make sure that I spell things out because people don't always see the benefits in what you're trying to tell them.
Yeah,
And you can't
absolutely.
assume that they do. Sometimes you need to make sure that that point is clear so that those extra 3 words made all the difference in the National Park Service for
Yeah.
people to clean out after their pets. Whereas before, some people think, well, it's obvious, right? You should just do that because that's your duty, that's your job as a pet owner. But it's still, you got to show that connection and you got to make it explicit and really spell it out in some cases.
Yeah, and without trying to be patronizing, but I do think it is about spelling it out. And I also think what makes people more receptive to a message is sometimes you have to point out the pain before you provide the prescription, if you like. So I can talk about, we need to develop a more positive mindset. And I can talk about these 7 questions, which I do. But I find people engaged in the 7 questions when I first of all talk about, sometimes we get into ways of thinking that are not helpful. They hurt us. They hinder our ability to succeed. And I unpack, it might be, you listen too much to your inner critic rather than listen to your inner coach, or you end up wearing like a victim t-shirt and you're a bit of a martyr. And I say, well, let's just think if we get into that way of thinking, this is not going to help us thrive and flourish. And then I say, but I've got some good news because I'm not just going to tell you to be positive. I'm now going to give you some questions you can start to ask yourself that become the antidote to what I call that faulty thinking. And I think, again, people become more receptive when they realize I do have a bit of a problem. If I don't think I've got a problem, I'm not open to a solution. But when you help me realize we could have a problem here, and this could be the impact of that problem, then I think people are more, you're right, that happens to me. I do beat myself up. I am overcritical. I am a perfectionist. And what can you do? What can you say that will help me, Paul? And people become more receptive as a result.
Agree with you completely on that. Great ways of doing that. And it's common sense, right? But it's an important piece of communicating and influencing and impacting the audience. And I love how in all of your communication, you really stress people think in pictures and relate to stories. So images can increase the impact. I know that during your programs that I've seen, you put images of, say, David Beckham, of Madonna, and Bill Gates does the same thing during his presentation. A lot of successful people do this since it really evokes more meaning. It makes it more memorable and it gets people to really connect better with those
Yeah,
statements,
I mean,
facts, figures.
absolutely. I mean, you think about maybe it's wired into us as humans because you think about when we discovered how humans, Homo sapiens were communicating 200,000 years ago, and you start to see these cave pictures. And you think, yeah, and then what did we do as language evolved? We told stories. So there are things to learn from our ancestors. And we've just decided we need to just give you lots of bullet points and text on and some of the text is that small because you want to fit it all on one slide. And I'm like going, you're here to connect with your audience, not conduct a side test. This is not, an optician's convention. And sometimes, like you say, I mean, it's an old phrase, but it's true. A picture can paint 1,000 words, and it can do.
And that's great. I love for us to kind of go through ways in which you can incorporate or someone could incorporate more stories into what they're trying to state. Now, this doesn't have to be for a presentation or for a speech. It could be just in the way that you're communicating, maybe with your children, maybe with a team member, whatever the case may be. Stories are relevant to the audience. They're easily remembered. They're packed with emotion. you go through how it really connects and uses your whole brain because you're painting a picture in someone's mind. You're using their emotions, you're using all five senses, and there's different ways to do it. So you don't always have to say, let me tell you a story, right?
Exactly. And because sometimes people think, well, I'm in business. I'm not here to, and you're not, when I say story, you're not saying once upon a time in a world far away. But in my book, How to Speak to People Really Listen, one of the chapters is called Lessons from JC, Joe, and the Greek Guy. And again, that's partly as a chapter heading. It's like Lessons from JC, Joe, and the Greek Guy. What's this about? It draws you in. And JC represents that those initials are Jesus Christ. Joe is actually the first name of J.K. Rowling. She's known by initials, but actually she's actually her real name is Joanne, but she's often referred to as Joe. And the Greek guy was Aesop, who did his fables. And if you were to use, and I appreciate, again, people may have different faiths or no faith at all, but if you were just to use that example of the Jewish rabbi from 2,000 years ago, and he's asked the question, who is my neighbor? He doesn't get a flipping map out and draw some circles. He doesn't bring some philosophical abstract idea. He said, there was a guy walking down the road and he gets beaten up. And then this person passes him by, and then that person passes him by. And then a Samaritan cares for him. Now, Jesus knew his audience were very anti-Samaritan. Samaria was an area and they didn't get on with the Jews. So he takes something controversial. It's memorable, but well, who was this man who got beaten up on the Jericho road? Who was his neighbor? And it's like, it's provocative. It gets your attention. The Harry Potter book, which the link to where I'm based, which is near Manchester, is the idea for that book came to J.K. Rowling on a delayed train from Manchester to London. And, she'd worked as a secretary at Amnesty International, and she was a single parent. But she came up with an idea, and that book sold probably about 500 million copies worldwide. So I constantly think we need to think, saying, you might even start off by going, I just put the phone down on a conversation I had with a customer. Folks, I need to tell you what that customer said about their experience being with us, or I remember my first day leading a team and I was nervous, and you just lead people in. You see, what's interesting, Charles, is when we're having a cup of coffee or having lunch with someone or a drink with friends or a meal, we're full of stories. Hey, you'll never guess what happened to me today. And then when we stand up and do a presentation, we leave our stories as if they're not relevant. And it's, facts tell, stories sell. Now, to emphasize, you need both. We need to communicate with facts and with logic and with reason. It's not one or the other, it's both. But in my experience, a lot of people rely on the facts and think that stories are for children. Stories are for everyone.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's so relevant and important to today's culture, to leader effectiveness. How do we build a storytelling culture? Because I know that with B2B sales, B2C sales, but really with B2B, they don't think in terms of stories. They don't try to connect it on an individual level very often. When they do, I think it's very effective. I've seen it personally, I've seen it professionally, I've seen it with colleagues, that when they use stories, when they're able to connect emotionally, take the customer through a journey. I love one quote that I had from another IMS educator saying, you don't retell a story, you relive a story.
Yeah.
And you put them in the scene and make them connect. But it's so hard to get in that mindset, right? Are there any tips or tools that you've had or that you've noticed that would help our listeners to say, okay, here's how you build this storytelling culture. Here's how you start this process.
I think one for some leaders is, first of all, just to model it a bit more as an example. But also, it might not even be you using this word story. You might be saying, like, if you're talking to a customer, you might say, okay, let me give you an example of something that happened to a customer last week, the challenge they had. Here's what happened. We got this phone call at 8:30 in the morning. The customer was completely irate. They were upset. They couldn't even control what they were saying. And we had to but here's what we did to help them. And even in a team meeting, okay, who's got some great examples of, how we've been living our, I mean, I'm going to be doing some work with Amazon, and Jeff Bezos has these leadership principles. Well, they are not things that are on a wall. They are things that are lived and breathed and talked about every single day. Now, perhaps a meeting at Amazon sometimes might be, okay, anyone got an example of how they've been living out one of our values today, one of our leadership principles? And someone then maybe say, well, yeah, I've got an example because earlier on today, dot, dot, dot. So rather than even thinking about the word story, think about, I want to just share something that happened yesterday, last week, last month, or let me give you an example of how this has worked in practice. So, and also as a leader, I mean, there are people who can actually train you on how to become a more effective storyteller. And you don't need to be, an actor to do it. It's just be you, share your stuff, and realize that stories stick.
Agree with you. That brings to mind Ritz-Carlton. Talked about this on a prior episode. They have 12 values, I believe, still, and they have weekly or daily huddles. And each week they find stories that illustrate these values, and people come together and say, let me tell you about integrity, and let me show you through this. They don't say story, but through this example, through this customer experience, on how this was indicated, how this was illustrated, how we really live by these values. So that's so important to have that storytelling culture. I would also say that with storytelling, everyone can be a better storyteller. It's not a gift that you have or you don't have. You can develop this skill like you can lots of different leadership skills. And I love the metaphors and analogies you put in your book. In this case, that brings to mind the one that don't use a machine gun to fire figures at people. Use a paintbrush to paint a memorable and meaningful story, right? So that they will remember it, so it connects better with them, and that you can influence them so much more effectively.
And it's interesting, even when we think about it's not a story, but how we're just trying to communicate in a more visual, memorable way. So that's rather than saying, look, 78% of our customers think this, you could actually say, look, nearly 8 out of 10 of our customers say this. And I've actually, Charles, at times got people up on stage and put up in a line and then got, say, 2 at the end and say, okay, so if these 10 people represent our customers or represent our employees, when we did that employee survey, this amount said this is what they thought about us. This is the amount that said they would recommend us to someone to work. And it becomes incredibly visual. You are again painting a picture, perhaps not through a story, but by presenting things in a way that we go back to one of our original points, makes what you say sticky and memorable. And when you think about what you've said about the huddles of Ritz-Carlton, one of the things that they are doing is another idea that I have in my book and in my seminars to do with IMS, which is repetition aids retention. You don't just say something once to make it sticky and memorable. And if we go back to Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and again, not in any way trying to judge them as people or their policies, but make America great again, make America great again, make America great again. I mean, it was just repeated constantly. When Boris Johnson was running to become the prime minister, when we had a general election, it was like, what do you think about education? And his first thing was, well, first of all, he said, we need to get Brexit done. Yeah, but what do you think about the NHS? We need to get Brexit done. And he just had this motto, get Brexit done, because he knew, again, understood the audience, whether we voted to leave the EU or remain. We were bored of the subject. And he just ran on really one policy above all, which was get Brexit done, make America great again. Now, we need to have substance behind what we're saying, but I want your listeners and those viewing it just to think, okay, how can I take some of these ideas and sync them up with all the other good stuff I do already, but make it more memorable? Because we don't want to just communicate, we want to connect. And we want to maybe that connection to bring some kind of action and transformation. Rather than just hit the head, you want to hit the heart as well.
I love that. And that's a great way to end this episode. Thank you so much, Paul. As we reach the end of this episode, always love to have a call to action to our listeners. If there's one thing, one tip maybe that you can give them to get them started down this road to make that message more sticky, memorable, to connect with the audience, to use more engaging stories or images, is there one thing they can do right now to get started that they can maybe put into practice today, this week?
I think one of the ideas I would have is remember the 90-90 rule. That is 90 stroke 90. And that is to think that perhaps 90% of the impact you make on your audience, you have made within the first 90 seconds. So that next meeting you're going to, that next presentation you're going to give some focus and thought to what those first 90 seconds are going to look like and feel like and sound like. And some of the ideas we talked about today could help you do that.
Great advice. Thank you for joining us today, Paul. Remind our listeners how they can get in touch with you.
Well, if you just Google the term the SUMO guy, you will reach me. You can have a website, thesumoguy.com. I'm on Twitter at the Sumo Guy. I'm on Instagram at the Sumo Guy. And I've just launched in trying to connect with perhaps a younger audience not as familiar with. I've got onto TikTok and I'm at the Sumo Guy. So wherever you go, the Sumo Guy will be somewhere near you.
Thank you, Paul, for a great episode today and sharing valuable insights and tools and techniques with our listeners.
My absolute pleasure, Charles. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.